August 7, 1944, 2:10 a.m. somewhere outside Saint-Lô, France. The rain has just stopped, but the mud hasn't gotten the message. Engines growl softly in the darkness, dozens of them, their heat fogging the night air. Headlights stay off. Orders are strict. No light, no stops, no hesitation. A young American truck driver grips the steering wheel until his knuckles ache. He hasn't slept in nearly 30 hours. The road ahead is barely a road at all, just a scar torn through hedgerows and bomb craters, marked by a single red sign nailed crookedly to a tree. A red ball. He doesn't know who put it there. He doesn't know who decided this route exists. He only knows one thing. If he stops moving, men at the front will die. Somewhere far ahead, beyond the hedges, beyond the smoke, General George S. Patton's Third Army is running out of fuel. And no one planned for that. 3 days earlier, Patton's tanks had burst through the German lines at avalanches like water through a shattered dam. Sherman columns rolled east and south at a speed unseen in modern warfare. German units collapsed, roads filled with prisoners, entire divisions disintegrated. It was everything Allied commanders had dreamed of since Normandy, and everything they feared. Because victory moves fast, but supply moves slow. Very slow. The Allied invasion plan had assumed one hard truth: the armies would crawl across France, ports would be captured gradually, railroads would be repaired methodically, logistics would follow behind the fighting like they always had. But Patton didn't crawl. He sprinted. Within days, his armored spearheads were outrunning their fuel depots by hundreds of miles. Ammunition trucks lagged behind, rations vanished, spare parts never arrived. And the rail system, the backbone of every European army since Napoleon, was gone. Not damaged, destroyed. Allied bombers had done their job too well. Bridges lay twisted in rivers. Switching yards were craters. Tracks disappeared beneath rubble and corpses. The railroads that were supposed to feed the liberation of France no longer existed. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, the maps began to tell a terrifying story. Green arrows showing Allied advances stretched farther and farther east. Red lines showing supply routes stopped. One staff officer quietly wrote a single word in the margin of his briefing notes: unsustainable. In a tent lit by flickering bulbs near Cherbourg, senior logistics officers argued over charts and timetables. Colonels pointed, generals frowned. Everyone spoke in numbers. Tonnage, throughput, capacity. None of it mattered, because Patton was burning fuel faster than anyone could calculate. By mid-August, his tanks were consuming nearly 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Each armored division required food, water, artillery shells, tank rounds, replacement engines, a river of material that never stopped flowing. Except now it had. One officer put it bluntly. "If we don't move supplies by road," he said, "the advance ends, not tomorrow, today." Silence followed. Moving that volume by truck had never been attempted, not at this scale, not over this distance, not through combat zones. Trucks broke down, drivers got lost, roads clogged instantly. Military police couldn't control traffic even on good days. To most of the room, the idea sounded insane. But in the back of the tent sat a man no one was listening to. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Albert Ayers. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a battlefield commander. He didn't wear decorations that drew attention. Before the war, he'd worked rail schedules and freight coordination in the United States. He understood movement, flow, timing. And as he studied the chaos on the maps, he realized something everyone else missed. The problem wasn't the number of trucks. It was the way they were being used. Trucks were stopping, turning around, waiting for orders, crossing paths, getting lost, colliding, bottlenecking. They were behaving like peacetime vehicles. But this wasn't peacetime. This was an emergency artery, and arteries only work one way. Ayers stepped forward. He proposed something radical. No two-way traffic. No returns during daylight. No wandering routes. Instead, a continuous loop. One direction only. Loaded trucks would move toward the front nonstop. Empty trucks would return on a separate route. Military police would control every intersection. Routes would be marked with simple symbols any exhausted driver could recognize instantly. No maps needed. Just color. A red circle. The red ball. It was a railroad concept applied to wheels. At first, the room resisted. It sounded too simple, too improvised, too unofficial. But Patton's fuel gauges were dropping by the hour. So someone finally said the words that changed the war's momentum. Try it. Within 48 hours, thousands of trucks were pulled from every available unit. Mechanics worked through the night. Drivers were reassigned, many without training on the vehicles they'd be driving. Most were African American soldiers from segregated transportation units, men who had trained for years only to be kept far from the spotlight of combat. Now they were being handed the most important mission in Europe. Move the war forward. Military police nailed red markers to trees, fences, ruins, even church walls. A continuous loop stretched from the Normandy beaches toward the advancing front. The orders were blunt. Drive fast. Do not stop. If your truck breaks down, push it off the road and keep moving. Accidents were inevitable. So were deaths. But failure was not. On the night the Red Ball Express officially began, the first convoy rolled out under blackout conditions. Engines thundered, dust rose, the road shook beneath thousands of tires. Within hours, fuel began arriving where none had been that morning. Patton's tanks roared back to life. The advance continued, and no one yet understood what they had just unleashed. Because within days, the Red Ball Express would become the largest, fastest, most dangerous supply operation ever attempted, run not by generals, but by exhausted drivers racing the clock of history itself. And soon, even that would not be enough. The convoy never truly stopped. Even at dawn, when the mist lifted from the French countryside, the road still vibrated, a low, constant tremor carried through mud and stone. Truck after truck surged forward in tight columns, canvas flapping, engines screaming in protest. To the men driving them, time blurred. Minutes felt like hours. Hours disappeared entirely. A Red Ball driver was allowed 6 hours of sleep every 2 days, on paper. In reality, most slept when their bodies simply shut down. Some collapsed beside their trucks while mechanics refueled. Others nodded off at the wheel and woke only when the truck lurched violently over shell holes. There were no headlights, no brake lights, no second chances. The road was governed by one rule only. Keep moving. Military police stood at intersections with white armbands and pistols drawn, not to threaten the enemy, but to threaten hesitation. Any civilian cart, Allied jeep, or staff car that drifted onto the Red Ball route was shoved aside without apology. This road belonged to the war, and the men who drove it began to understand something terrifying. They were now closer to death than many infantrymen. German aircraft still prowled the skies. Though the Luftwaffe was weakened, it wasn't dead. Single fighters slipped through at dusk, diving low to strafe long columns of trucks that stretched for miles. Drivers learned to recognize the sound instantly. A distant whine, then screaming metal. When attacks came, there was no stopping to take cover. Slamming on the brakes meant death, from collision, from fire, from chaos rippling backward through the convoy. So they drove through it. Trucks burned on the roadside, flames licking toward the hedgerows. Ammunition exploded in short, violent bursts, and the rest of the convoy passed without slowing, faces lit orange by fires they couldn't stop to extinguish. If one truck was lost, another had to replace it. Always forward. Always now. By the third week of August, the scale of the operation stunned even SHAEF planners. Nearly 6,000 trucks were now assigned to the Red Ball Express. They hauled gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans stacked to the canvas roof. They hauled artillery shells heavy enough to snap axles. They hauled rations, medical supplies, spare tank tracks, engine parts, and sometimes the wounded, because there was no other transport left. Every day, the system moved over 12,000 tons of supplies. It should not have worked. It did anyway. The roads, medieval paths never meant for modern vehicles, disintegrated under the weight. Dust clouds rose so thick that drivers navigated by the taillights of the truck ahead, even though taillights weren't allowed. So they tied rags to bumpers. White during the day, red at night. Primitive, effective. The Express became its own living organism, adapting by instinct faster than headquarters could issue orders. When bridges collapsed, drivers found fords. When signs vanished, locals pointed. When fuel ran low, someone always siphoned just enough from the next truck to keep both moving. Rules bent. Purpose did not. At the front, Patton noticed the difference immediately. Fuel that should have taken a week arrived overnight. Ammunition shortages eased. Tank engines roared instead of idled uselessly at roadside. Patton pushed harder. He demanded more. "Tell them I need gasoline," he snapped. "Not tomorrow, today." And somehow it came. But success carried a hidden cost. The trucks were dying. By early September, nearly 1/3 of the Red Ball fleet was damaged or destroyed. Tires shredded. Transmissions burned out. Engines seized from nonstop use. Replacement parts didn't exist in sufficient numbers. So drivers and mechanics improvised. They cannibalized wrecks. They welded broken frames with scrap metal. They used rope where steel should have been. Trucks held together by faith and profanity rolled back onto the road. Many never returned. And still the line kept moving. Yet even as the Red Ball Express became legendary, a dangerous illusion formed at Allied headquarters. They began to believe it could solve everything. It couldn't. The further the armies advanced, the longer the loop stretched. What had begun as a short emergency route now ran hundreds of miles across France. Every extra mile burned fuel just to deliver fuel. A logistical paradox. By mid-September, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Patton's spearheads were within striking distance of the German border, but his tanks were once again running dry. The Red Ball Express was performing miracles. But miracles are not sustainable. And in a quiet moment, one exhausted logistics officer wrote another word in the margin of his map. Breaking point. Because while the trucks still moved, the system behind them was starting to crack. And soon, the war would demand more than even this relentless road could give. Early September 1944, near Verdun. The road is silent for the first time in weeks. Not peaceful, just empty. A fuel truck sits on the shoulder, its engine ticking as it cools. The driver hasn't moved in hours, not because he doesn't want to, because there's nothing left to deliver. Ahead, Patton's armored columns wait in long, motionless lines. Sherman's idle with engines off. Tank crews sit on turrets, smoking, staring east toward Germany, close enough to taste. And they cannot move. The irony is unbearable. They have beaten the enemy. They have broken out of Normandy. They have crossed France faster than any army in history. and now they are stopped by success itself. The Red Ball Express had done the impossible. But the impossible had a limit. Every mile the front advanced stretched the supply line thinner. Trucks that once made 2 or 3 runs per day now barely completed one. Fuel burned delivering fuel. Tires wore down faster than replacements arrived. Drivers were collapsing. Some fell asleep while standing. Others hallucinated from exhaustion. Accident reports piled up. So did casualties, though few would ever make headlines. They were not dying gloriously. They were dying quietly, on roads no one would remember. At SHAEF headquarters, the arguments returned louder now, edged with fear. Some commanders wanted Patton slowed permanently. Others demanded priority shifted north toward Montgomery's push in the Netherlands. There were only so many trucks. Only so much fuel. Every decision meant one army advanced, and another waited. And for the men of the Red Ball Express, that decision was felt instantly. One morning, orders changed. Entire convoys were redirected north. Patton's Third Army felt the loss within hours. By nightfall, tank units reported less than 1 day of gasoline remaining. The great breakout, the dream of driving straight into Germany, was slipping away. Patton raged. He slammed his riding crop against map tables. He accused staff officers of strangling victory. He demanded trucks that did not exist and fuel that could not be created. But logistics does not bend to willpower. Not even Patton. The truth was brutal. The Red Ball Express had saved the campaign, but it could not win the war alone. Railroads had to be rebuilt. Ports had to be captured. The system that had carried the Allies through crisis now revealed its final lesson. Speed is not everything. Sustainment is. And yet, even as its role diminished, the Red Ball Express left behind something extraordinary. It proved that wars are not won only by generals. They are won by movement, by timing, by men whose names never appear in communiques. Over 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers, serving in segregated units, often commanded by white officers who would later receive the credit. They endured discrimination, brutal schedules, enemy fire, and crushing responsibility, all while knowing that if they failed, the front would collapse. Few medals were awarded. Few speeches given. But every mile liberated across France bore their tire tracks. When rail lines finally reopened and ports like Antwerp came online, the Red Ball Express was gradually scaled down. The road that never slept was allowed to rest. Its signs were removed. Its loops dissolved. Its miracle quietly folded into history. Years later, veterans would struggle to explain what it felt like. Not heroism, not glory, just urgency. A constant, pounding certainty that somewhere ahead, unseen, someone was depending on them. A tank crew waiting for fuel. A medic waiting for morphine. An infantryman waiting for ammunition. The Red Ball Express never appeared in victory photographs. But without it, many of those photographs would never have been taken. Because while bullets decide battles, logistics decides whether battles can happen at all. And for a brief, desperate moment in 1944, a simple idea, born from a railroad clerk's understanding of flow and direction, carried an entire army across a continent. Not with brilliance, but with motion.